"Get off my planet." The words echoed through the empty corridor, their edges sharp and unforgiving. Kethra Vallis, commander of the elite Deathworlder Special Forces, didn't yell. She never had to. Her voice carried the weight of molten steel, a quiet fury that promised annihilation to anyone foolish enough to challenge her. The alien mercenaries, a ragged band of syndicate recruits, froze mid-step. Their weapons trembled in clawed hands as they exchanged panicked glances. They had heard stories, legends about humans from Deathworld-class planets. But this was something else. A sharp hiss from the overhead ventilation system broke the silence, accompanied by the distant hum of a failing reactor. The air, already thick with tension, seemed to congeal further. Kethra's footsteps echoed closer. Calm, measured, inevitable. If you're ready to dive into this pulse-pounding, otherworldly journey, make sure to subscribe for more gripping tales. Like this story, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Now, let's continue. The mercenaries weren't cowards. They had stormed orbital stations, toppled regimes, and turned peaceful colonies into smoldering ash. They had stared down plasma bolts and razor drones, confident in their superior numbers and advanced tech. But now, standing in the narrow confines of the derelict freighter Halcyon's grave, all they could think about was the single word that whispered through their collective mind: Deathworlder. To outsiders, the term was a mere classification, a cold, scientific label for planets so hostile to life that surviving on them seemed an evolutionary accident. But to those in the interstellar underworld, it was something far more visceral. Deathworlders were monsters in the guise of sentience, born in gravity that crushed bones, atmospheres that corroded flesh, and ecosystems that actively tried to kill them every second of every day. And humans? They were the apex of that nightmare. The mercenaries shifted uneasily as Kethra's shadow preceded her around the bend. She wasn't tall by galactic standards, nor was she outwardly imposing. Clad in matte black armor that seemed to drink in the dim light, she carried no visible weaponry. Her presence alone, however, was enough to sap the courage from the most battle-hardened among them. "Do you know why I let you live this long?" Kethra asked, her voice cutting through the gloom like a blade. No one answered. A low growl escaped one of the larger mercenaries, a hulking Regoran with emerald scales and tusks like polished obsidian. He hefted his energy lance, aiming its glowing tip directly at her heart. Kethra stopped, tilting her head as if amused. "Because I wanted you to see why we're feared." The words were barely out of her mouth before she moved. One moment she was a silhouette, still and unthreatening, and the next she was a whirlwind of motion. The Regoran had no time to react. 1 second he was aiming his lance. The next he was slammed against the bulkhead, his weapon clattering to the floor. His comrades barely managed a strangled shout before Kethra lunged again, her movements an impossible blur. The ensuing chaos was both horrifying and mesmerizing. Kethra didn't rely on brute strength or high-tech gadgets. Her lethality came from precision, a terrifying efficiency honed on a world where missteps meant death. A clawed hand reached for her neck, only to be twisted at an unnatural angle. A tail swung toward her ribs, but she ducked and countered with a strike that sent the attacker sprawling. Within moments, the corridor was silent again. Bodies lay crumpled, groaning or unconscious, as Kethra stood amidst them, unscathed. She knelt beside the Regoran, whose once defiant eyes were now wide with fear. Leaning in close, she whispered, "Run. Tell the Syndicate what you saw. Tell them why alien mercenaries feared Deathworlders." For a moment, no one moved. Then, scrambling on all fours, the Regoran bolted down the corridor, leaving his comrades to their fates. Kethra straightened, adjusting the vambrace on her left wrist. Her eyes flicked to the ship's central console, where a flickering hollow display showed a countdown. Less than 5 minutes until the reactor reached critical mass. "Time to go," she muttered, striding toward the airlock without a backward glance. Behind her, the defeated mercenaries struggled to pull themselves together, too dazed to stop her. They wouldn't be alive much longer anyway. As the freighter's bulkhead sealed behind her, Kethra stepped into the cockpit of her personal dropship, the Obsidian Wraith. Her pilot, a wiry cyborg named Jex, glanced over his shoulder, his synthetic eye whirring softly. "Rough crowd," he quipped. "They'll think twice before taking syndicate contracts again," Kethra replied, buckling herself into the co-pilot seat. "Punch it, Jex. I don't want to be here when this place blows." With a nod, Jex engaged the thrusters, and the Obsidian Wraith shot into the inky void of space. Behind them, the Halcyon's grave erupted in a brilliant burst of light, its fiery demise briefly illuminating the dark expanse. Kethra leaned back, her adrenaline finally ebbing. Another mission complete, another syndicate operation crippled. But as she stared out at the stars, a shadow of unease crossed her mind. Something about this job felt too easy. And in her line of work, easy was often a trap. She turned to Jex, her voice calm but firm. "Set course for Outpost 17, and run a deep scan on syndicate comms. I want to know what they're planning next." Jex's cybernetic fingers danced across the controls. "You got it, boss. But, you think they'll let us rest for once?" Kethra smirked, though her eyes remained cold. "Rest is for the dead, Jex. And we're not dead yet." The Obsidian Wraith cut through the silent expanse of space like a predatory shadow. Kethra sat in the cockpit, her eyes fixed on the swirling void outside, but her mind churned with possibilities. The Syndicate didn't operate in half measures. Every mission she'd undertaken against them had been brutal, calculated, and precise. For the operation aboard the Halcyon's grave to have gone as smoothly as it had, something was amiss. Jex broke the silence first, his voice modulated with a faint mechanical rasp. "You're brooding again. Makes me nervous when you do that." Kethra didn't respond immediately. She turned her chair slightly, her gaze meeting Jex's. His augmented features, a patchwork of human and machine, were lit by the soft glow of the ship's console. "Do you think it was too easy?" she asked, her voice low. Jex arched a synthetic brow. "You wiped out an entire squad of syndicate mercs in less than 5 minutes, and now you're complaining it was easy?" He snorted. "Some of us might call that a win, you know." She shook her head. "No, it doesn't feel right. That freighter was supposed to be carrying syndicate battle plans, but there was nothing. Just those mercs, a few low-level grunts. No cargo, no intel. And they barely put up a fight." Jex's fingers hovered over the controls. "Maybe they got spooked. Syndicate's not exactly known for its courage when it comes to Deathworlders. Or maybe it was a distraction," Kethra countered. "A setup to keep us busy, while they move something bigger." Jex frowned, his good eye narrowing. "You think they knew we'd hit the Halcyon's grave?" "I think we were meant to find it," she replied. "But not for the reason we thought." As if on cue, the ship's console lit up with a sharp chime. A series of syndicate comm channels had been decrypted, and a flood of intercepted messages began scrolling across the display. Jex leaned forward, his cybernetic hand tapping rapidly as he sifted through the data. "Looks like you're on to something," he muttered. "Most of these are routine chatter. Supply runs, personnel movements, but this..." He paused, isolating a single transmission. The audio was garbled, distorted by encryption, but the words were clear enough. "Project Revenant is proceeding as planned. Ensure the prototype reaches Valkyr Nexus undetected. Failure is not an option." Kethra's stomach tightened. She had heard whispers of Project Revenant before, a Black Ops initiative rumored to be the Syndicate's answer to Deathworlder superiority. If those whispers were true, the Syndicate was developing something that could tip the scales in their favor. "Valkyr Nexus," she said, tasting the name like poison. "That's a fortified Syndicate stronghold. No one gets in or out without clearance codes and a death wish." Jex smirked. "Good thing we've got plenty of both." Kethra's lips twitched in the faintest approximation of a smile. "Set course for the Nexus, but keep us off their long-range scanners. We're not walking into this blind." As Jex plotted their trajectory, Kethra stood and made her way to the ship's armory. The narrow room was lined with weapons and gear, each piece meticulously maintained. She ran her fingers along the edge of her combat knife, its blade honed to a razor's edge. Deathworlder or not, she knew better than to underestimate the Syndicate. They weren't the kind of enemy that relied on brute force alone. They were cunning, adaptive, and relentless. If they had finally found a way to counter her kind, the consequences could be catastrophic, not just for her team, but for every Deathworlder who had ever fought to earn their place in the galaxy. Her thoughts were interrupted by the ship's intercom. "Kethra," Jex called, "you're going to want to see this." She returned to the cockpit, where Jex had pulled up a live feed from a nearby communications relay. The image was grainy, but it showed a Syndicate convoy, a fleet of sleek, black ships, escorting a massive, armored transport. "That's our prototype," Jex said. No doubt about it. Kethra studied the convoy, her mind already calculating probabilities. The transport was heavily shielded, its escorts bristling with weaponry. A direct assault would be suicide, but then again, she wasn't known for playing fair. "Intercept cores," she ordered. "We're taking that transport before it reaches the Nexus." Jex hesitated. "You sure about this? That's a lot of firepower for just the two of us." "We've faced worse," Kethra replied. "Besides, we're not taking on the entire convoy, just the transport. If we hit fast and hard, we can take them out before the escorts know what's happening." Jex nodded reluctantly, adjusting their heading. "All right, boss. But if this goes south, I'm blaming you." Kethra smirked, settling into her seat. "Fair enough. Let's show them why they fear us." The Obsidian Wraith powered up its cloaking systems, its sleek frame vanishing into the void. As they closed the distance to the convoy, Kethra's pulse quickened. This wasn't just another mission. This was a battle for survival. Not just hers, but for every Deathworlder who refused to bow to the galaxy's predators. She gripped the armrest of her chair, her resolve solidifying like tempered steel. The Syndicate thought they could control the chaos, bend the universe to their will. They were wrong. Deathworlders didn't just survive chaos. They thrived in it. The Obsidian Wraith drifted in the void, cloaked and silent, as it stalked the Syndicate convoy from a safe distance. The armored transport at the center of the formation was a fortress in motion, its hull gleaming with energy shields that shimmered faintly against the starlight. Around it, the escort ships moved in a precise formation, their paths overlapping like a predatory web. Kethra studied the display with a cold, calculating gaze. Every flicker of the convoy's movement, every shift in their formation, was a puzzle piece waiting to be solved. She tapped a finger against her vambrace, pulling up an overlay of potential weak points. "Those shields are too dense for a frontal assault," she muttered, more to herself than to Jex. "We need to disable the transport's power core. If we can breach the rear exhaust vent, it'll force them to drop shields to prevent overload." Jex frowned, his synthetic eyes zooming in on the vent in question. "That's a hell of a shot to line up, even for you. And once the shields are down, their escorts will be all over us." Kethra leaned back, her mind racing. "We won't be around long enough for them to react. The vents only expose during their cooling cycle, every 90 seconds. We'll time it perfectly." Jex let out a low whistle. "You do love your impossible plans, don't you? It's what keeps us alive," she replied with a faint smirk. "Position us for the shot. I'll handle the rest." The Obsidian Wraith slid into position, maintaining its cloaked approach as it crept closer to the convoy. Inside the cockpit, the tension was palpable, an electric charge that buzzed beneath their calm exterior. Kethra's hands moved with practiced ease as she calibrated the ship's targeting systems, her focus unyielding. The moment arrived. A faint shimmer ran along the transport's rear as the cooling cycle began, exposing a narrow vent just large enough for a precision strike. "Now!" Kethra commanded. The Obsidian Wraith decloaked for a fraction of a second, releasing a single, concentrated plasma bolt. The shot streaked through the void with deadly accuracy, striking the vent just as it began to close. The resulting explosion rippled along the transport's hull, and its shields flickered violently before collapsing altogether. "Direct hit," Jex shouted, his voice tinged with awe. "Move!" Kethra barked. The obsidian wraith darted forward, its engines roaring as it closed the gap to the now exposed transport. The escort ship scrambled to react, but the sheer audacity of the attack had caught them off guard. By the time they locked onto the obsidian wraith, Kethra and Jex were already aboard the transport. The boarding tube latched onto the transport's hull with a hiss, and Kethra wasted no time breaching the airlock. The interior was dimly lit, the corridors sterile and metallic. She moved with the practiced precision of a predator, her senses attuned to every sound and vibration. Jex followed close behind, his plasma rifle humming softly. "I don't like this," he muttered. "Where's the resistance?" "They're regrouping," Kethra replied. "Stay sharp." The pair advanced deeper into the ship, bypassing security doors and disabling surveillance systems as they went. Every step brought them closer to their objective, the prototype hidden in the ship's core. When they finally reached the containment chamber, Kethra's instinct screamed at her to stop. The room was eerily quiet, bathed in a pale, flickering light. In the center of the chamber stood a reinforced stasis pod, its surface etched with syndicate insignias and warning glyphs. Jex approached the pod cautiously, his mechanical fingers brushing against the control panel. "This is it," he said, his voice hushed. "Project Revenant." Kethra's eyes narrowed. "Open it." With a few swift keystrokes, Jex disengaged the pod's locks. The hiss of decompression filled the room as the pod's lid slid open, revealing its contents. Inside lay a humanoid figure, its body encased in sleek, black armor that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The figure's features were obscured by a visor, but the faint rise and fall of its chest indicated it was alive. "What the hell is that?" Jex whispered. Kethra's jaw tightened. "A weapon?" Before she could elaborate, the figure stirred. Its movements were slow at first, almost mechanical, but then its head turned sharply toward them. The visor's surface lit up with a crimson glow, and a synthetic voice emanated from within. "Designation, Revenant. Objective: neutralize Deathworlder threat." Kethra barely had time to react before the figure lunged. It moved with a speed and precision that rivaled her own, its strikes calculated to exploit weaknesses she didn't even know she had. The chamber erupted into chaos as Kethra and Jex fought to counter the Revenant's assault. Plasma bolts ricocheted off its armor, and Kethra's knife barely scratched its surface. It was relentless, its attacks unyielding and adaptive. "This isn't just a weapon," Kethra shouted over the din it's learning. Jex ducked a blow that would have crushed his skull, firing a desperate shot that managed to knock the Revenant back a step. "Then we need to stop teaching it." Kethra's mind raced as she analyzed the creature's movements. It was fast, stronger than her, and clearly designed to counter every advantage a Deathworlder had. But it wasn't invincible. She just needed to find the flaw. "Keep it distracted," she ordered, diving toward the control panel. Her fingers flew over the keys as she accessed the stasis pod's failsafe systems. The Revenant turned toward her, but Jex stepped into its path, his plasma rifle blazing. "Not so fast, you tin can." Kethra found the failsafe, a last resort measure designed to neutralize the pod's occupant in the event of containment breach. She didn't hesitate. With a single press of a button, a surge of energy coursed through the chamber, enveloping the Revenant in a crackling field of light. The creature let out a mechanical roar as its movements faltered. Finally, it collapsed to the floor, its armor smoking and sparking. Kethra stood over it, her chest heaving. Whatever the Syndicate's planning, this is just the beginning. Jex looked at her, his face pale. If this thing's a prototype, what's the finished product going to look like? Kethra didn't answer. She didn't have to. The implications were clear and terrifying. Hours passed as Kethra and Jex watched the Lyra work, the sterile glow of the laboratory casting long shadows against the walls. The rhythmic hum of machines and the sharp clink of instruments filled the air, underscoring the tension that hung heavy in the observation room. Kethra's hands rested on the console, her fingers drumming a restless beat as she replayed the events aboard the transport in her mind. Jex finally broke the silence. "You're thinking too loud again." Kethra shot him a sidelong glance but didn't reply. Instead, her focus shifted back to the lab, where Lyra had just extracted a glowing module from the Revenant's chest cavity. The faint pulse of crimson light within the device mirrored the rhythm of a heartbeat. Lyra's voice crackled over the comm. "This is it, the neural matrix. It's even more advanced than I anticipated. The architecture is a hybrid of biological neurons and quantum circuits. It's not just a machine. It's alive in a sense." Jex leaned forward, frowning. "Alive? Like sentient?" "Not quite," Lyra replied. "It's more like a predator's instinct given form. It doesn't think or reason like we do, but it adapts with terrifying efficiency. And the more it fights, the more it learns." Kethra's eyes narrowed. "Can you extract its data without triggering a reaction?" "I'm working on it," Lyra said, her tone clipped. "This is delicate work. One wrong move and we could reactivate it. Or worse, alert the Syndicate to our location." That possibility hung in the air like a storm cloud. The Syndicate wasn't known for forgiveness, and if they suspected that their prototype had fallen into Deathworlder hands, they would stop at nothing to recover it. Kethra straightened, her instincts on high alert. "How much longer?" "Patience, Kethra," Lyra said, her voice laced with dry amusement. "This isn't something you can brute force." Jex snorted. "Try telling her that." Before Kethra could retort, the observation room's proximity alarm blared, cutting through the tension like a knife. The holographic display lit up with a flurry of red warnings as the outpost's long-range sensors detected incoming ships. Lyra's voice sharpened. "What's going on?" Jex was already at the console, his fingers flying over the controls. "We've got Syndicate vessels inbound, 3 cruisers fully armed. They must have tracked us after all." Kethra's jaw clenched. "How long until they're in range?" 15 minutes, maybe less," Jex replied. "We're outgunned, Kethra. Even with the outpost defenses, we won't last long against that kind of firepower." Lyra's voice cut through the comm. "Then you'll need to buy me time. I'm close to isolating the neural matrix's core data. If we can decrypt it, we might find out what the Syndicate's really up to." Kethra's mind raced. They couldn't risk losing the Revenant's data, but neither could they afford to let the Syndicate overrun the outpost. The choice was clear, but it wasn't one she relished. "Jex," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument, "get the defenses online. Divert all power to the asteroid's turrets and shields. I'll handle the rest." Jex hesitated. "You're not seriously thinking about taking them on alone, are you?" Kethra's lips curved into a grim smile. "They're not afraid of me for nothing." Without waiting for a response, she strode out of the observation room, her boots echoing against the metal floor. She made her way to the armory, where her combat gear and weapons awaited. Strapping on her armor, she felt the familiar weight settle over her shoulders, like an old companion. Her fingers lingered on the hilt of her combat knife, its blade gleaming in the dim light. This was a weapon that had earned her reputation, the tool that had made Syndicate mercenaries whisper her name in fear. It wasn't just a weapon, it was a promise. By the time she reached the hangar, the Obsidian Wraith was powered up and ready. Jex's voice crackled over her comm. "Kethra, are you sure about this? You're one person against 3 Syndicate cruisers." "I don't need to beat them," she replied, sliding into the pilot's seat. "I just need to keep them busy." The Wraith roared to life, its engines flaring as it shot out of the hangar. The asteroid loomed behind her, its surface bristling with concealed turrets that sprang to life as the Syndicate ships entered range. Plasma fire lit up the void as the battle began in earnest. Kethra guided the Wraith with precision, weaving through enemy fire as she targeted weak points in the cruiser's formations. She knew the Syndicate's tactics well enough to predict their movements, exploiting every opening to keep them on the defensive. The comm crackled with Jex's voice. "Kethra, turrets are holding, but shields won't last much longer. Illyria's still working on the Matrix. Tell her to work faster," Kethra snapped, her voice tight with focus. She looped the Wraith around one of the cruisers, unleashing a barrage of plasma bolts that sent its shields into a flickering spiral. But even as she scored a direct hit, the remaining ships adjusted their strategy, coordinating their firepower in a way that forced her to retreat. Kethra's pulse pounded in her ears as she pushed the Wraith to its limits. This wasn't a fight she could win, but it wasn't about winning. It was about surviving long enough to give Illyria the time she needed. Inside the outpost, Illyria's fingers moved with frenetic energy, her gaze locked on the neural matrix as she extracted its core data. The device pulsed ominously, as if aware of her efforts. "Illyria," Jex called out from the command center. "We've got minutes, maybe less. Whatever you're doing, wrap it up now." "I need another 60 seconds, Illyria shot back. "Keep them off me." Back in the cockpit, Kethra's grip tightened on the controls as the Syndicate ships closed in. The Wraith shuddered under the impact of enemy fire, alarms blaring in protest. "Jex," she said through gritted teeth, "is the data secure?" "We're almost there," he replied. "Hold on just a little longer." Kethra's lips twisted into a feral grin. "Holding's not my style." She angled the Wraith toward the lead cruiser, her finger hovering over the weapon's controls. If she was going down, she intended to make it count. The Obsidian Wraith surged forward, weaving through a chaotic storm of plasma fire. Kethra felt the vibrations of the hull under her fingertips, the ship groaning in protest as it absorbed the impacts of enemy volleys. Her vision narrowed, adrenaline sharpening every detail. The blue glow of the cruiser's thrusters, the flicker of energy shields buckling under relentless attacks, and the glint of her targeting systems locking onto weak points in the enemy formation. Inside the outpost, Jex's hands danced across the command console, his jaw set in grim determination. "Illyria, the shields are down to 20%. If you're going to do something, now's the time." "I'm almost there," Illyria snapped, sweat beading on her forehead as she extracted the final strand of data from the Revenant's neural matrix. The device emitted a low, throbbing hum, the crimson glow at its core intensifying. "This thing's fighting me every step of the way. It's like it knows I'm pulling it apart." "Well, tell it to hurry up and die already," Jex muttered, his focus shifting to the defense systems. The asteroid's turret spat fire at the advancing cruisers, but the Syndicate ships adapted quickly, their formations shifting to minimize damage. Meanwhile, Kethra had maneuvered the Wraith into the heart of the enemy fleet. With a flick of her wrist, she triggered a barrage of torpedoes that streaked toward the nearest cruiser. The explosion rippled across its hull, shredding armor and exposing vulnerable conduits. But the retaliation was immediate. A concentrated blast of energy slammed into the Wraith, sending the ship spiraling out of control. Kethra gritted her teeth, fighting the G-forces as she wrestled the controls. The cockpit lights flickered, and warning alarms blared in a chaotic symphony. "Kethra," Jex's voice crackled through the comm, "get out of there. The Wraith can't take much more." "I'm not done yet," she growled, stabilizing the ship with sheer force of will. Her eyes darted to the sensor array. One cruiser was crippled, but the other two were closing in fast. She had seconds to act. Back at the outpost, Illyria's voice rang out over the comm, "I've got it. The data's secure, but the Matrix is destabilizing. If it goes critical, we're all toast." "Then eject it," Jex shouted, his fingers flying over the controls. "Kethra, did you hear that? We've got the data. Get clear." Kethra's lips curled into a feral grin, not without sending a message first. Before Jex could argue, she angled the Wraith toward the closest cruiser, her targeting systems locking onto the ship's core reactor. With the last of her torpedoes loaded, she prepared for a suicide run. "Kethra, no!" Jex's voice was raw with panic. "There's no coming back from that." "I know," she replied, her voice steady. "But they'll remember this day." In the instant before she fired, a massive explosion rocked the battlefield. A chain reaction erupted from the asteroid surface, where Lyra had jettisoned the destabilizing neural matrix. The Revenant's core detonated with a ferocity that lit up the void, its shockwave consuming the nearest cruiser in an instant. The Wraith was caught in the blast's outer edge, spinning wildly as the shockwave ripped through its systems. Kethra barely managed to stabilize the ship, her breathing ragged as she assessed the damage. The remaining cruiser hesitated, its sensors clearly scrambled by the unexpected chaos. Inside the outpost, Jex let out a shaky breath. "Elira, what the hell was that?" "The neural matrix," she replied, her voice tight. "It had a failsafe, a self-destruct mechanism. I triggered it before it could reactivate, but the energy release was more than anticipated." "That's one way to put it," Jex muttered, his eyes flicking to the rapidly diminishing fleet. The surviving Syndicate ships were retreating, their damaged systems unable to mount a counterattack. Kethra's voice crackled over the comm. "They're pulling back. For now." Jex sagged against the console, relief washing over him. "You're insane, you know that?" Kethra chuckled weakly. "Takes one to know one." The Wraith limped back to the outpost, its hull scorched and systems barely holding together. By the time it docked, Kethra was met with a mixture of applause and exasperation from the outpost crew. Elira stood at the forefront, her expression unreadable as she clutched a data drive in one hand. "You nearly got us all killed," she said, though her tone lacked its usual sharpness. "But we didn't," Kethra replied, stepping out of the cockpit with a smirk. "And now we've got what we need." Elira held up the drive. "This contains everything I could pull from the Revenant before it detonated. The Syndicate's plans, their weaknesses, and their next target." Kethra's smirk faded, replaced by a hard glint in her eyes. "Then we use it." Elira nodded. "This isn't over, Kethra. The Syndicate won't stop until they perfected their prototype, or wiped us out trying." "Let them come," Kethra said, her voice cold as steel. "We'll be ready." Jex groaned, slumping into a nearby chair. "I was hoping for a break, but sure, let's poke the hornet's nest some more." As the outpost crew began repairs and preparations, Kethra took a moment to gaze out at the stars beyond the observation window. The Syndicate had underestimated Deathworlders, but the fight was far from over. They would strike back, not just for survival, but to remind the galaxy why alien mercenaries feared them in the first place. The aftermath of the Syndicate's retreat left the outpost in a state of tense reprieve. The asteroid's defenses had barely held. The corridors now alive with the clamor of repairs and hushed, hurried conversations. Kethra leaned against the observation deck's railing, her eyes fixed on the void outside. The stars glimmered like distant embers, indifferent to the chaos she had just endured. Jex approached her, a small toolkit slung over his shoulder. He'd been assisting the crew in patching up the outpost's critical systems, though the strain of the battle still lingered in the dark circles under his eyes. "Can't sit still, can you?" he asked, his tone lighter than his expression. Kethra didn't turn, her gaze still on the stars. "Sitting still gets you killed." Jex sighed, dropping into a chair nearby. "You know, most people would take a moment to celebrate not dying in a fiery explosion. You're already planning your next move, aren't you?" She finally looked at him, her face as unreadable as ever. "You saw the data Elira pulled. This isn't over. The Syndicate isn't going to stop because we blew up one prototype and scared off a few ships. If anything, they'll escalate." "Yeah, I got that memo," Jex said, rubbing his temples. "But maybe let's not rush into the teeth of the beast just yet. We need a strategy, resources, allies. Kethra raised an eyebrow. "You think anyone out there is willing to stand with us against the Syndicate? Most would sell us out for a handful of credits." Jex smirked. You'd be surprised. Not everyone's a cynic like you. Before Kethra could respond, Alira's voice came over to calm both of you to the lab. Now, Jex groaned, pushing himself up. Great. What now? Another doomsday revelation. Kethra didn't reply, already striding toward the lab. The corridors were dim, the emergency lighting casting long shadows that mirrored the unease running through the station. By the time they arrived, Alira was hunched over a console. The neural matrices extracted data displayed in a dizzying array of holograms. What is it? Kethra asked, her voice sharp. Alira glanced at them, her face drawn with exhaustion. I decrypted the last segment of the matrix's core data. It's worse than we thought. Jex threw up his hands. Of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? Alira ignored him, pointing to a cluster of star maps highlighted in red. These are Syndicate facilities, research labs, production hubs, testing grounds. The Revenant wasn't just a one-off experiment. They're building more, a lot more. How many? Kethra asked, her tone flat. Dozens, maybe hundreds, Alira said. They're creating an army, and they've already started deployment. Some of these locations show recent activity. Targets they've hit, territories they've destabilized. Jex frowned, leaning closer to the display. And they're focusing on Deathworlder colonies. Alira nodded grimly. It makes sense. We're their biggest threat. If they can wipe us out, nothing stands between them and galactic domination. Kethra's jaw tightened. Then we hit them first. Alira raised an eyebrow. And how exactly do you propose we do that? The Syndicate's resources dwarf ours. We're one damaged outpost and a single half-crippled ship. Then we don't fight them head-on, Kethra said, her voice cold and calculating. We use the information we have to disrupt their operations, cut off their supply lines, sabotage their production, hit them where it hurts. Jex exchanged a glance with Alira. That's a solid plan and all, but we're going to need help. If they're targeting Deathworlder colonies, that means we're not the only ones fighting back. We find those people, rally them to our side. Kethra hesitated. The idea of relying on others didn't sit well with her. Too many times, she'd seen supposed allies fold under pressure or turn traitor when the stakes were high. But Jex was right. They couldn't do this alone. Fine, she said finally. We reach out, but we don't make promises we can't keep. If they join us, they need to know what they're signing up for. Alira smirked faintly. They'll know. Deathworlders don't scare easy. The decision made, the trio set to work. Alira began compiling a list of potential allies based on the Matrix's data, highlighting Deathworlder colonies and resistance groups already targeted by the Syndicate. Jex coordinated with the outpost's crew to repair the Obsidian Wraith and prepare it for the long journey ahead. As the days passed, the atmosphere in the outpost shifted. The initial shock of the Syndicate's attack gave way to a simmering resolve. The crew, though battered and weary, threw themselves into their tasks with grim determination. The scars of battle were a reminder of what they were fighting for and what they stood to lose. Kethra, ever restless, spent her time training in the outpost combat simulators. Each session was a brutal display of precision and ferocity, her movements honed by years of surviving against impossible odds. To her, the fight wasn't just about survival, it was about sending a message. By the time the Wraith was ready to launch, the outpost had become a beacon of defiance. Word had already begun to spread among Deathworlder communities, a whisper of resistance, a call to arms. Kethra and her crew weren't just fighting for themselves anymore. They were fighting for every Deathworlder who had ever been hunted, betrayed, or underestimated. As the ship departed, the crew gathered in the cockpit, their eyes fixed on the stars ahead. The Syndicate loomed as a shadow over the galaxy, but in the face of that darkness, they were a spark waiting to ignite. Kethra's voice broke the silence. We've got one shot at this. No second chances, no safety nets. If any of you want out, this is your last chance. Jex snorted. You think we've come this far just to turn tail now? Please? Elira crossed her arms, her smirk returning. Besides, someone needs to keep you from getting yourself killed. Kethra's lips twitched into the faintest hint of a smile. Then let's get to work. The obsidian wraith accelerated into the vast expanse of space, its destination unknown, but its purpose clear. The fight ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine, but for now, they were united, and that Kethra knew was their greatest weapon. The journey through the void was silent, but far from peaceful. The obsidian wraith cut through space with deadly precision, its engines humming steadily as it sped toward their first target, a Syndicate research facility on the outer rim. The crew was gathered in the cockpit, each one lost in their own thoughts, the weight of what they were about to do settling on their shoulders. Kethra sat in the pilot's seat, her fingers lightly tracing the edge of the control panel. Her mind was sharp, focused on the mission ahead, but the thought of what was at stake gnawed at the edges of her consciousness. Every plan, every calculated risk had led to this point. If they failed, it wouldn't just be the end for them. It would be the beginning of a larger war, one the Syndicate would wage until every Deathworlder was wiped out. Jex stood behind her, his eyes scanning the system's readouts. We've got a clear path so far. No sign of Syndicate patrols in the vicinity. We'll be in their airspace in less than an hour. Kethra nodded but didn't look away from the view ahead. The stars stretched out in a silent, unforgiving expanse, the distance between them and their target closing with every passing moment. Elira, how's the infiltration plan shaping up? She asked, her voice low. Elira, sitting in the secondary command chair, looked up from the console, her brow furrowed. We're still. Good. The facility's security systems are outdated, but they've got some heavy automated defense turrets we'll need to disable first. Once that's done, we'll have an opening to get inside and extract any useful intel. And if it's a trap? Kethra asked, her voice hard with suspicion. Elira hesitated, but only for a moment. Then we adapt. We always do. Jex grinned, his eyes gleaming with a dangerous glint. That's the spirit. But, next time, maybe we don't plan for everything to explode. Just saying. Kethra shot him a sideways glance. You're one to talk. You're the one who rigged the outpost self-destruct sequence, remember? Fair point, Jex muttered, hands raised in mock surrender. Kethra's lips twitched, but she quickly turned her attention back to the task at hand. The Syndicate's operation wasn't just about power. It was about control, about subjugating the galaxy's most dangerous species, and testing the boundaries of technology and biology in the pursuit of something far darker than anyone realized. The Revenant prototype had been the first sign of their true intentions, and it was only the beginning. As the Wraith drew closer to the facility's outer perimeter, Elira's voice broke the tense silence again. I've got their access codes from the data we recovered. I'll override their security systems just as we arrive. Jex, once we're in, you'll need to focus on disabling their comms and any heavy weaponry they've got. Jex grunted. Simple enough. You're sure we can do this without setting off the whole station? We have to, Kethra said, her voice steady but with an edge. We're not here for a fight. We're here for information. The moment they realize we're here, they'll move their operations and we lose the advantage. Then let's make it quick, Elira said. I don't like the idea of being caught in a small space station with Syndicate goons closing in on us. The Wraith shuddered as the gravity well of the station pulled at the ship's engines and the communication panels flickered to life. Kethra's eyes narrowed as she watched the data feed flash across the screens. Almost there, Jex muttered, a grin curling at the corner of his mouth. It's time for a little sneak attack. The Wraith dropped out of subspace with a sudden jolt, its hull vibrating as the ship glided toward the outer rings of the Syndicate facility. The station was massive, gleaming, dark, and heavily fortified. Automated defense platforms scattered around its perimeter blinked to life, their sensors scanning the area, their weapons ready for any sign of trouble. But they wouldn't expect trouble to come from a ship like the Wraith, quiet, agile, and deadly in the shadows. As the ship drifted closer, Illyra tapped a few commands into the console, her fingers moving rapidly over the interface. The outer shields flickered for a split second, then went dark, indicating the security breach was in progress. Shields down for a few seconds. "That's our window," Illyra warned. Kethra adjusted the ship's angle and powered forward. The Wraith slipped through the cracks in the defenses, bypassing the main turrets and docking at a hidden airlock on the station's far side. The crew quickly suited up, each preparing for the infiltration. The atmosphere was heavy with anticipation as Kethra, Jex, and Illyra gathered at the airlock. Kethra's mind was sharp, her pulse steady. The quiet before a mission was always the hardest. She could feel the weight of her crew's expectations pressing down on her, but she didn't let it show. Jex gave a thumbs up before activating the airlock's manual override. With a hiss, the door slid open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the Syndicate station. The sterile scent of metal and old machinery filled the air, mixing with the faint hum of generators and the muffled clank of distant doors opening and closing. "This is it," Kethra said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Stay sharp and keep quiet. We're here for data, not blood." "Not yet, anyway." They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the thick metallic flooring. Every hallway, every room was an opportunity to gather intel, but also a potential trap. The Syndicate was not known for being careless, and their defenses were precise and ruthless. Illyra led the way, hacking into terminal after terminal, extracting data with speed and efficiency. Jex kept watch, his eyes darting to every shadow, his pulse rifle held ready. Kethra scanned the room, her senses on high alert, every instinct telling her that the longer they stayed inside the station, the greater the risk they faced. After what felt like hours, Illyra found what they were looking for, a hidden data vault deep within the facility's core. "Got it," Illyra muttered, pulling a small data chip from the terminal. "This is everything. Plans, research, and their current active deployments. We've got a full picture now." Kethra nodded. "Good. Let's get out of here." But as they turned to leave, the soft hum of alarms began to wail throughout the station. "Shit," Jex hissed. "They know we're here." Kethra's eyes narrowed. "I'll buy you time." "Like hell you will," Jex shot back. "We stick together." Without hesitation, Kethra led the crew down the narrow corridor, their pace quickening as the facility came alive with the harsh sound of metallic doors slamming open. The Syndicate was closing in. The air in the facility turned thick with tension as the crew sprinted down the narrow, dimly lit corridor. Kethra's mind raced, calculating escape routes, the quickest way to the airlock, and the risks they faced with every step they took. Behind them, the sound of footfalls grew louder, a chorus of robotic precision echoing down the halls. Syndicate enforcers, no doubt. They wouldn't go down without a fight. "Move, move, move." Kethra barked, her voice low but commanding. The data chip Illyra had secured was now their only bargaining chip. If they didn't make it out with it intact, everything they'd risked would have been for nothing. Illyra's breath was ragged, but her fingers worked with swift precision on the comm system. "I've got the airlock codes," she called over her shoulder. "We're almost there. Just keep running." The sound of pursuit intensified, and Kethra's eyes flicked to the rear view of the corridor. The shadows ahead of them were now punctuated with flashes of light as automated turrets emerged, their red sensors snapping into focus. Kethra had anticipated this. She spun on her heel, her weapon drawn, and fired in one smooth motion. The turrets exploded in a series of sparks and metal fragments. The hallway erupted with the sound of detonating circuits. "We've got a breach," Illyra shouted, the urgency in her voice rising. "We need to move, now." Kethra didn't hesitate, her pulse pounding as she turned back to the others. "Go!" she shouted. Jex, already in motion, bolted ahead. His pace was relentless, his footfalls a blur against the cold metal floor. Kethra followed closely, Illyra just behind her, the data chip tucked safely in Illyra's vest, was their lifeline, and Kethra wasn't about to let it fall into enemy hands. The corridors twisted and turned, but Kethra had memorized the layout in advance. She'd studied every inch of the facility before they even set foot on the station. They weren't just stealing intel. They were stealing time. Time they couldn't afford to waste. If the Syndicate caught them here, they'd never make it back to the ship. As they neared the airlock, a shrill alarm blared, signaling that the station was going into lockdown. Kethra cursed under her breath, pushing herself harder, her legs burning as she propelled forward. The distant clatter of armored boots told her they were closing in fast, and she knew the turrets wouldn't be far behind. "We're going to have company," Jex shouted. "Get that airlock open." "Working on it," Elira replied, her voice steady despite the panic rising all around them. Her fingers flew over the console as she quickly hacked into the control systems. The countdown for the airlock's release started ticking in her mind, each second stretching into an eternity. Come on, Kethra muttered, her eyes darting to the entry doors ahead. Her grip tightened around her rifle. If they didn't get through that door in the next few seconds, they'd be dead in the water. The Syndicate's enforcers weren't known for their mercy. Just as the first of the enforcers rounded the corner, weapons raised, Elira hit the final key. The airlock slid open with a pneumatic hiss, and the crew rushed through, spilling into the docking bay. "Seal it!" Kethra yelled, her voice low and tight. The heavy metal doors began to close behind them with an eerie slowness, but it was too late. The Syndicate soldiers opened fire just as the doors slammed shut, their shots ricocheting harmlessly off the reinforced panels. Panting, Kethra spun toward the Wraith, parked just a few meters away. The ship was their only means of escape, and the Syndicate wasn't going to let them go that easily. "Get to the ship," Kethra shouted, her voice urgent as she sprinted toward the Wraith's entrance. The others followed closely, but behind them, the sound of footsteps and clanking metal grew louder. Just as they reached the airlock, the sound of a large explosion shook the station. Kethra's heart skipped a beat as she looked back over her shoulder. A small breach in the station's hull sent a shower of sparks cascading down the hallway. The Syndicate wasn't taking any chances. They were already setting traps. Jex threw open the ship's hatch. "Hurry! We're not out of the woods yet." The crew piled into the ship's cramped entryway, but before they could even make it to the cockpit, a volley of fire from Syndicate drones filled the space. Kethra barely ducked in time as one of the shots grazed the hull, sending a ripple of sparks across the ship's internal systems. "Elira," Kethra shouted, "get us out of here. I'm working on it." Elira snapped, already at the helm, her hands flying over the control panel. The engines roared to life as the Wraith began to move, but Kethra knew it wasn't going to be easy. The Syndicate's drones were fast and deadly. If they weren't careful, the Wraith would be a sitting target. As Elira piloted the ship into the station's bay, Kethra turned to Jex, who was already loading up another round of charges. "We've got to clear a path. I'll cover you. Get those drones off our tail." Jex grinned. "You got it, boss," with a grunt. Kethra positioned herself by the side of the ship, using the Wraith's mounted weapons to lay down a barrage of fire. The drones scattered, but not quickly enough. One of them managed to land a direct hit on the ship's engine, sending a jolt of energy through the hull. "We're losing power," Elira shouted. "We need more time." "Jex," Kethra barked, "get those drones off us, now!" Jex moved with practiced precision, targeting one drone after another, each explosion sending a pulse of satisfaction through Kethra's veins. But she knew they couldn't stay in one place for long. The Syndicate's reinforcements would be arriving soon. If they didn't make it out now, they wouldn't have another chance. As the last drone exploded in a burst of fiery fragments, Kethra turned to Elira. "Full speed. Now." The Wraith shot forward, engines roaring as they broke free of the station's gravitational pull. The station began to fade into the distance, but Kethra knew they weren't safe yet. The real fight was still ahead, and the Syndicate wasn't going to give up easily. "We've got the data," Alira said, her voice steady. "Now, let's see what we can do with it." Kethra looked out at the stars, her mind already racing with possibilities. They had won this round, but the war was just beginning. And for the first time in a long while, Kethra allowed herself a moment of hope. They were still alive, and that meant the fight wasn't over. The stars outside the Wraith's viewport stretched into streaks of light as the ship sailed deeper into the emptiness of space. The station they'd just left was now a distant, fading memory, but the weight of the mission and its consequences still pressed down on Kethra's chest. She leaned back in her chair, staring at the starfield, trying to suppress the tension that had built up over the past several days. Despite their narrow escape, the success of the mission hung like a double-edged sword. The data they had secured was invaluable. It contained everything: plans for new Syndicate weapons, covert research on Deathworlder genetics, and the location of other hidden Syndicate installations. But in their hands, the Syndicate's nightmare could become their salvation or their undoing. It was a risk they'd all been willing to take. But now that the mission was complete, the enormity of what they had stolen from the Syndicate felt more real than ever. "We did it," Alira murmured, her voice almost lost under the hum of the ship's engines. Kethra turned to face her. "We've taken the first step, but we're far from done." Her gaze shifted to Jex, who was seated nearby, his feet propped up on a cargo crate. He was grinning as usual, but Kethra could see the weariness in his eyes. "What's our next move?" Jex asked, his voice casual but edged with the kind of focus only a mercenary like him could muster. Kethra didn't immediately answer. She felt the sting of her own exhaustion, but the truth was there was no time for rest. The Syndicate would come after them with everything they had, and the Wraith was a small target, but it wouldn't remain unnoticed forever. The crew would need to go underground, lay low for a while, and regroup. They had the information they needed, but now came the difficult part, getting it out into the right hands. "We need to head to one of the Resistance strongholds," Kethra said after a long pause. "It's the only way to make sure this data reaches those who can use it." Alira nodded. "That's a good idea. But do you think we can trust them? The Resistance has a tendency to take whatever they want and leave us with the scraps." Kethra's lips pressed into a tight line. She had known Alira would bring that up. The Resistance wasn't perfect. It wasn't even entirely reliable. But at this point, they were the only option. If they could make it to the Coalition forces, they would have a fighting chance. But first, they'd need to get there and survive whatever traps the Syndicate had laid for them. "We don't have a choice," Kethra said. "The Syndicate won't stop hunting us until every last bit of this data is erased. We need allies." Jex swung his legs off the crate and stood up, cracking his neck as he did. "Fine. But if the Resistance tries to take all the glory for themselves, I'm not playing nice." He smirked, but Kethra could see the skepticism behind his eyes. He'd never been one for alliances. He preferred to rely on his own strength, his own cunning. "We'll make it work," Kethra replied, her voice firm. She turned to Alira. "Prep the ship for a jump to the nearest Coalition outpost. We've got a long haul ahead of us." The next few hours were spent preparing for the jump, each member of the crew handling their tasks with a focus that came from years of experience. Kethra took a moment to check the star charts on the navigation console, making sure the course was clear. They had to avoid Syndicate patrol routes and find a safe passage through the void. Finally, Alira gave a nod. "Ready to go." Kethra nodded back. "Punch it." The Wraith hummed to life as the engines powered up, the ship's systems aligning to execute a jump through subspace. The stars outside seemed to swirl and stretch as the ship entered the jump gate, the darkness of space swallowing them whole. Kethra leaned back in her chair again, closing her eyes for a moment. It had been an exhausting mission, and the dangers were far from over. But for now, they were free, at least for a little while, and that small victory was enough to carry them through the next leg of the journey. The jump would take them close to the Coalition stronghold, but there were still dangers in store. The Syndicate wasn't going to let them escape so easily. Every moment, was a countdown. But in that fleeting moment of calm, as the stars outside the viewport blurred into streaks of light, Kethra allowed herself a small, rare smile. They had survived, and that meant there was still hope. "Keep an eye on those sensors," Kethra said softly to Jex, her gaze returning to the viewport. "We may have outrun the Syndicate, but we've got no idea what else is waiting for us out here." Jex grinned and gave her a mock salute. "You worry too much. If anything comes at us, I'll blow it out of the sky. You know that." "I know," Kethra replied, her voice filled with a mix of affection and wariness. "Just don't get cocky." Elira glanced back at them from her position at the helm. "We'll make it. We always do." And as the Wraith glided silently through the dark void, Kethra allowed herself to believe it. They'd made it this far, and whatever came next, they would face it together.